November had already thinned when I first noticed the photograph propped against a stack of unpaid bills on the little wooden easel my aunt used like a rotating domestic shrine. Rain smeared the windowpane. The house smelled faintly of coffee and lemon oil. In the photograph my mother was laughing at my sister. The light caught the lenses of her glasses and turned them into little private moons. My sister's hand was mid-gesture. That picture was not the moment that began everything. It was the snapshot that followed the rupture, a quiet, ordinary proof that family life accrues heirlooms and blemishes in equal measure, each demanding tending. It stood there, a modest witness to what had happened and to what it required, long, repetitive labor. To situate that morning properly, I have to step back a little. The country in which we lived had been bruised by the cultural debates of 2012 and 2013, arguments that began in newspapers and lecture halls and then, more dangerously, migrated into living rooms and kitchen tables. By the summer of 2014, the vocabulary of public shaming and moral spectacle had hardened in ways that made private failing easier to translate into public verdict. Social media, already adept at turning intimate quarrels into viral moral exercises, saturated conversations with a readiness to convert rumor into indictment. The political calendar of 2016 was looming, bringing with it an increasing appetite for tidy narratives and public moral arithmetic. Against that wider background, our family's rupture began as an ordinary thing, a vote in August 2014. Put the date, August 2014, on a calendar and it looks unremarkable, an unassuming weekday. In context it was a hinge. The vote itself was not spectacular, no cameras, no formal press release. It was a tally, a procedural outcome in a small arena of family decision-making. Yet the tally hardened into something else. Rumors took root and grew teeth. What might have been an administrative failing within one relationship insinuated itself into the ledger of reputations. By the time the calendar turned to Thanksgiving, the tally sat like an extra weight in our pockets. We carried it with us even when we tried not to. Thanksgiving Day, November 27, 2014. Arrived with my private rehearsal. In my head the dining room would become a makeshift courtroom, my sister at the center, the relatives cast as jurors. I imagined speeches, accusations, maybe even a public apology. What unfolded instead was quieter, but in its ordinariness more consequential. People cooked, carried dishes through our narrow corridor, and set them on the table. Someone brought a potato salad that tasted like summer. Another offered a roast that needed salt but was served with a smile. A toddler, my cousin's child, sat on the kitchen floor under the table, legs splayed, insistent on contact with whoever would give it. That toddler's nearness was, in many ways, the earliest form of therapy. The room found a rhythm. When old judgments surfaced, they were met not with litigation but with recipes and remembrances. The communal refusal to let the tally alone define us became the first, tentative experiment in repair. We did not announce it as such. Nobody wrote a policy. We simply refused, in small gestures, to convert family grief into public spectacle. That refusal, anonymous, diffused, mundane, was the beginning of a different possibility. The following year we tried to make those possibilities legible and repeatable. On November 26, 2015, at the next Thanksgiving, we placed a tidy stack of index cards and a small box at the center of the table. The prompt was modest: write one small act of kindness you had witnessed that year. No one pretended that this would erase the vote. No one expected dramatic forgiveness to be declared over dessert. We read the cards after the plates had been cleared, amid coffee cups, a fork tapping a plate, the rustle of paper. Uncle's sprawling handwriting read, "Brought soup after the last storm." A niece's blocky letters named the librarian who stayed late to help a single mother. The notes did not rewrite history, but they reoriented attention, from ledger to care, from accusation to the concrete practices that sustained ordinary life. Habit, not eloquence, became the engine. Small acts, noticed and named, began to gather like steady drops into a stream. This approach did not dissolve the shadow of the vote. Older relatives warned against letting people off too easy, treating accountability as a matter of balancing accounts rather than rebuilding relations. Those warnings required patient responses, sometimes argument, often quiet listening, sometimes the discipline of saying nothing until indignation had run its course. Over the winter of 2016 into 2017, repetition and time softened some attitudes. Some minds changed, others did not. I learned a practical lesson that felt, at first, tactical rather than noble. In a household, the reduction of heat matters more than winning an argument. If a place where people live can be a site for cooling, for containment instead of escalation, then it is functioning as it should. Practical consequences appeared quickly. In January 2015 we had to manage estate forms, medical records, and the tired choreography of probate lawyers. Those people who know, instinctively, the weary air of fractured families. These chores were not about moral vindication, they were about capacity and clarity. Who could access records, who would speak to doctors, who would be the logistics point person. Relatives argued for transparency, others feared weaponized documents. We struck a compromise, necessary disclosures that satisfied legal requirements and discretion where discretion was permitted. The tedium of signatures, not a sermon, became reparative. Attention to facts, deadlines, and paperwork had a stabilizing force. Managing documents is unromantic, but it has a kind of custodial integrity. The fallout touched my professional life as well. I write about people and about care, those often invisible networks that sustain life. And after 2015 my work increasingly gravitated toward the intermediaries of dignity, care coordinators keeping lists, night nurses who read to lonely patients, librarians who doubled as social workers. Editors noticed. My pieces, granular and unglamorous, resonated because specificity feels like truth when generalities have been exhausted. Invitations followed, talks, a recurring column in a regional magazine, a panel at a writers' festival. I tried to be careful with framing. In a public talk in New York on March 12, 2018, and another in Boston in October 2018, I argued for proportionality, consequences designed to restore capacity rather than humiliate, and insisted that repair is not merely apology. Accountability, I said repeatedly, should rebuild someone's ability to live responsibly. It should not be reduced to a performance of moral superiority. That professional path and the home experiments were fed by something else, therapy. I began seeing a therapist in early 2016. The sessions were not a cure so much as a training regimen, exercises in discernment, learning to tell when a moral radar had detected genuine danger and when it had grown oversensitive. One small tool, gratitude exercises, naming 3 small good things each day, felt at first dangerously close to sentiment. The practice, whose clinical roots extend into the late 1990s and had become common in the 2010s, eventually proved itself as a discipline of attention. It trained me to notice reparable elements amid the mess, an unexpected call, an offered casserole, someone showing up on a Tuesday when they had promised. In therapy I learned de-escalation scripts, simple sentences that keep heat from escalating, how to state needs without accusation, and how to listen in ways that invite rather than demand confession. Rage, which can be intoxicating, had to be redirected, into writing, into organizing, into boundary setting. Where rage was public spectacle, it could build audiences. Where it was private fuel, it could create infrastructure. Boundaries, in time, became an architecture of short scripts. A practiced line, "I am not interested in debating this now," worked to redirect conversations when the vote resurfaced. At first such refusals looked like withdrawal. Over months they came to be understood as limits that enabled continued contact without endless relitigating. Boundaries felt like mercy, preserving relationships by refusing to reopen wounds to feed someone's need for moral performance. Not all of the labor was conversational. We domesticated practical measures that were prosaic but effective. In March 2016 we assembled a binder of medical proxies, funeral wishes, and contact information. Plain, legible documents that kept administrative confusion from becoming a moral battleground. That binder sat on the whole shelf by the phone, signatures, notarizations, instructions. It was not dramatic. It was powerful. In summer 2016 the porch was repainted. I wrapped myself in a neighbor's knitted blanket and wrote small letters my mother loved. Lists, apologies, plans for repair. These letters were cheap and humble. "I'll pick up your prescription on Friday. I will call at 4, I'm coming by Saturday." Writing in this way became a domestic sacrament, mending socks, leaving a note taped to the fridge. The private labor of correspondence, of tending details, was the way we kept the household from splintering. Children had a way of cutting through complexity. At Thanksgiving 2016, a 12-year-old cousin asked whether grief could be charitable. Could sadness be given away to help someone else? The ingenuousness of the question suggested a simple truth. Care is often an answer to sorrow, and children make compassion feel like common sense rather than sentiment. Their presence required us to translate complex arguments into actions they could understand. These were small things: visiting, reading aloud, leaving a light on in the kitchen for a late return. The presence of children also softened the tone of conversations because cruelty felt less acceptable when little ears might be listening. The rituals we developed remained modest. On November 24, 2016, at Thanksgiving, we named the absent, those deceased, estranged, or ill, and followed the naming with small practical gestures: a casserole in the freezer, a folded note in a book, a check in the mail. Naming was never supposed to be theatrical. It was a way of acknowledging that absence carried a weight we did not want to ignore, and that practical supports were a kinder response than a single, overwrought public reckoning. Despite our practices, not everyone returned to the table. By 2018, some relatives chose distance. Distance is not always a moral failure. Sometimes it is a form of protection. Acknowledging that some estrangements would persist freed us from imagining every wound had to be closed by confession or a single act of public contrition. That acceptance altered how we allocated attention and resources. We could no longer proceed under the assumption that every fracture would be healed to everyone's satisfaction. Instead, we turned to the work that was possible. Some of that work was public-facing. In June 2017, I published an essay, and it was republished in a weekly magazine in September 2017. I tried to shape the telling to minimize harm. Language is a form of stewardship. Choosing what to tell and what to withhold is part of care. Sometimes I regretted what I had published or what I had left out. Sometimes silence became its own weapon. The piece emphasized caregivers who showed up without spectacle, neighbors who refused drama, the small acts, soup calls, that sustain life. I refused to let family tales become shorthand for abstract lessons. Where detail might expose someone vulnerable and trying to change, I withheld it. Where the story could teach a method, I retained it. Public appetite for scandal circled back. In late 2019, a columnist linked to the essay, and the piece found an enlarged audience. My inbox filled with messages in the winter of 2019 and again in the spring of 2020. Notes ranged from tender to condemnatory. Each intrusive message demanded a choice: engage, correct, or ignore. Over time, I developed a practice of disciplined discretion, rationing visibility, curating exposure, and deciding when clarification was worth the cost. Protecting the household from performative outrage sometimes felt like military strategy. You closed doors, bolted others, and minded the boundaries of what you would let be public. That practice had roots in other, more concrete planning. In March 2019, I drafted a hospital plan for a friend who wanted no spectacle at the end of life. "No spectacle, please," my mother used to say. Honoring that preference translated into procedures: restrict publicity, designate a trusted advocate, and limit visitors so conversations remained intimate. These were not abstract commitments but actionable instructions: who could be called, what the doctor could disclose, who could be present in the room. We used those private practices as templates to protect others in similar positions, turning domestic experience into procedural safeguards. Repair, we learned, is not mainly about rhetoric. It is about distribution of labor and the making of capacity. Over 3 or 4 years, the default at our gatherings shifted slowly and unevenly from accusation toward care. The change was modest: fewer exclusions, more chances to contribute, but it was visible. Judgment remained an option, but no longer the first instrument. Rituals substituted for spectacle. In April each year, the month my mother loved, we planted bulbs. These plantings were never photographed for social media. They remained private, practical acts: a stack of her books with a handwritten note, a casserole left at a neighbor's door. The vote remained a footnote and a lesson in what not to do. The daily gestures: soup on the doorstep, weekly visits, reading across town, remade our world into one where dignity was practiced rather than awarded. The kinds of repair that took hold were specific and often bureaucratic. In winter 2017, when my uncle had surgery and his children could not take the necessary time off work, A cousin organized a rotating schedule so someone would be present daily. A retired neighbor sat with him in the hospital when no family member could. Coordination cost money and time, but it kept the family from descending into blame. In January 2018, we formalized a rotating caregiving schedule so that the labor did not concentrate on the most available person. We found practical ways to prevent martyrdom, rotate responsibilities, offer modest stipends where possible, and make the labor visible and shareable. These modest logistical adaptations reduced resentment and created a culture of practical reciprocity. Restorative approaches were deployed where punitive ones had failed. One cousin who had stoked an ugly public fight volunteered at a shelter as restitution. Work and humility that, over months, rebuilt a measure of trust. Another relative, after mismanaging an elderly friend's money, accepted a repayment plan and financial counseling. These measures were halting and slow, they did not erase wounds. Yet they addressed harm in ways that allowed people to learn and to regain capacity. We learned to prefer inquiry to interrogation. The question helped me understand open doors, the demand to explain presumed a verdict and closed them. Even as we cultivated these practices, setbacks were inevitable. After Thanksgiving 2018, a cousin's social media rant dragged us backward, forcing renewed private conversations and tighter limits. Cultural change is not linear. There are fits and starts, regressions and recoveries. What made the difference between relapse and collapse was repetition. Modest tools that accumulated and became durable. We built a small repertoire, an index card box for naming kindnesses, started November 26, 2015, a binder of medical proxies and funeral wishes, assembled March 2016. A simple family agreement about publicity, formalized April 2017, a rotating caregiving schedule, launched January 2018, and scripts for redirecting old battles. Their modesty made them adoptable. Their durability made them effective. We also discovered that certain transitional rituals helped to lower temperature before hard conversations began. We would ask for 5 minutes of quiet breathing, or start with a shared observation about the house or whether to anchor attention in the domestic stake. Transitional phrases. Before we continue, can we agree not to name who is to blame and focus on what needs to happen next? Became practical tools to prevent dissolution into performance. These openings were not ingenuous, they were an attempt to shape the form of conversation so that it could produce action rather than spectacle. A central lesson emerged and kept reasserting itself. Shame tends to be wielded disproportionately against the precarious, and punishment that forgets capacity is cruelty. Effective accountability is proportional and practical. It requires time, assessment, and sometimes mediation to propose remedies that rebuild rather than raise. We moved from a model of moral arithmetic, debt, fine, public humiliation, to one of capacity building, financial counseling, volunteer work, supervised restitution, and concrete steps that demonstrated change. That kind of accountability is less dramatic. It is workmanlike and dull, which is precisely why it often succeeds where theatrical punishments fail. Repair was also uneven in who carried the labor. Some relatives bore disproportionate burdens. The caregiver who drove 40 miles, the person who handled paperwork, the cousin who coordinated meals. Repair had to honor that imbalance without turning those who did the labor into martyrs. We instituted rotation systems and small stipends, and we named the labor publicly within the family so that contributions were visible and not quietly taken for granted. Making the work legible reduced moral resentment. When labor could be shared and acknowledged, it produced less bitterness. Our apologies and rituals improved by practice. A good apology, we learned, is specific in its admission, accepts responsibility for particular harms, and includes a concrete reparative step. When someone offered specifics and a plan, time spent at a shelter, agreed repayment, or a concrete caring schedule, we recognized and rewarded it. Rituals also included naming rituals that were intentionally private. At Thanksgiving on November 24, 2016, for instance, naming the absent and leaving a casserole in the freezer. These were not performative acts of contrition but small, practical gestures that softened edges more effectively than grand public reckonings. Over time we also turned our attention outward. The vote had made clear how inadequate institutions magnify family distress. Understaffed social work departments, Byzantine benefits rules, fragile housing systems. These structural failures convert private disputes into crises. I began to write and advocate on these fronts. I penned op-eds in 2019 about home care reform and about clearer legal end-of-life processes, and in the winter of 2020 I raised these issues with local policymakers. The aim was not to displace private responsibility, but to lessen the burden families bear when institutions are thin. Better public supports reduce the need for families to perform moral theater. They redistribute the burden of care from the private sphere into public capacity. A maxim emerged from that work and from our domestic experiments: assume care until proven otherwise. The phrase is blunt and easily misunderstood. It does not deny harm or excuse wrongdoing. It simply places immediate priority on meeting needs, food, medicine, companionship, before embarking on a punitive process. When accountability follows care, it tends to be different in tone and consequence. Sometimes, when needs are met, accountability becomes unnecessary because the conditions that produced harm have been addressed. Often accountability comes later, and more productively, because the person who caused harm has been given the capacity to make amends. There were practical rules we passed down to younger relatives in the course of these years. I taught them how to keep a binder of important papers, how to schedule a meal train, how to create language that made consequences functional rather than punitive. We showed them the scripts for de-escalation and the 2-sentence lines to redirect conversation. In winter 2017, when emergency care threatened to fragment family ability to coordinate, it was the younger relatives who, armed with the binder and the rotating schedule, kept the day-to-day labor from collapsing into recrimination. Practical examples cemented lessons. The skills we passed along were the opposite of rhetorical flourish. They were about logistics, calendars, names and numbers, a simple clarifying question at a hospital bedside. Comedy labor also became part of our method. At Thanksgiving, one cousin would mock raise an imaginary hand: "Shall we auction the dessert for charity?" And the table would groan. Those small bits of mischief were not cruelty. They helped us own the absurdity of our predicaments. Comedy can be immunity, laughing at our own foolishness rather than at the person harmed. When humor tilted cruelly, we tightened boundaries quickly. The joke was a thermometer. When it stayed kind, it reduced temperature. When it became a weapon, we stepped in. Not every change was moral. Some were merely procedural but still consequential. We formalized a family agreement about publicity in April 2017 so that no single relative could turn a private hurt into public spectacle without consultation. The agreement was simple: no public statements about family disputes without a majority authorization. It was not perfect, but it established a norm and a default we could point to when tempers flared. We also refined a protocol for visiting the sick: designate an advocate to speak to doctors, limit visitors to maintain privacy, and keep a list of who had been in the room. These protocols were small and conservative, but they set boundaries that protected both dignity and practical functioning. There were symbolic acts, too, that carried weight because of their repetition. Every April we planted bulbs in a little strip of soil in front of the house, a month my mother loved. The plantings were always private, always modest: a stack of her books with a handwritten note tucked in, a casserole dropped on a neighbor's doorstep. We did not photograph these moments. We tended them the way one tends a lawn. The repetition mattered. Private rituals resisted the erasures and distortions of a social media moment and instead built a habit: show up, bring food, read aloud. Those habits, accumulated, rewrote expectations. If the default was care rather than accusation, dignity had a better chance of being preserved. The photograph on the easel continued to matter because it condensed those lessons. Visitors would glance at it and ask for the story. I learned to give a condensed, careful version. An August 2014 vote, Thanksgiving, November 27, 2014, when the first repair began, the index card experiment on November 26, 2015, the binder assembled in March 2016, the naming ritual on November 24, 2016, the family agreement about publicity in April 2017, the rotating caregiving schedule launched in January 2018, the talks in New York on March 12, 2018, and in Boston in October 2018, the essay published in June 2017 and republished in September 2017, the late 2019 pickup in which a columnist linked to it, the inboxes full of praise and condemnation in winter 2019 and spring 2020. I omitted names when exposure would harm those trying to change. I emphasized the neighbor with soup, the niece who read on Thursdays, the cousin who learned to listen. I passed on methods rather than fetishizing outrage. If pressed to distill what we learned into practical axioms, if asked for a short list of rules for managing family scandal and accountability, I would offer them in prose, not slogans. Make accountability proportionate and capacity restoring. Choose repairs daily, ordinary gestures over grand speeches. Treat boundaries as mercy, steward language carefully, cultivate simple rituals that reshape attention toward preservation rather than performance. Above all, prefer inquiry to interrogation. Ask how can we help? Before asking why did you do this? That order matters. I claim no final moral arrival. Fractures will persist. People will disappoint us. Some relatives walked away and never returned. Other relationships remained forever scarred by the choices they had made and the choices others made in response. But the daily habits we chose, bringing pies instead of headlines, reading kindness cards aloud, planting bulbs in April, softened past wreckage. They did not erase the vote, nor did they convert it into tidy redemption. They did something less showy and more durable. They replaced the idea that dignity is a trophy with the conviction that dignity is a baseline condition worth patient tending. There is a civic extension to these domestic practices. The project is both household and political. It asks for the practical redistribution of labor, for low-cost rituals that make accountability meaningful, and for acceptance that some distances are mercy. It argues for resisting spectacle and cultivating dull courage. Keep calling, keep arriving with soup, keep reading aloud. These small, unglamorous acts accumulate into a culture. Over years they rewrite expectations. When the default is care rather than accusation, dignity is more likely to be preserved. The photograph on the easel remains an index. Visitors ask for the story and I tell it as a chronology. The vote in August 2014, the Thanksgiving of November 27, 2014 that began repair, the modest rituals, index cards on November 26, 2015, the binder in March 2016, the naming ritual on November 24, 2016, the family agreement in April 2017, the rotating schedule in January 2018, that followed, the public essay in June 2017 and its republication in September 2017, the talks on March 12, 2018 and in October 2018, the setbacks after Thanksgiving. 2018, the hospital plan drafted in March 2019, the wider public attention in late 2019 and the difficult inboxes that returned in winter 2019 and spring 2020, and the work on policy and op-eds in 2019 and early 2020. I omit names to protect the vulnerable. I emphasize methods rather than giving voice to outrage. What I have taken from these years is not a set of maxims for moral purity, but a set of practices for survival and dignity. Practical accountability looks like a repayment plan, a season of volunteer work, enrollment in financial counseling, or a rotating caregiving schedule. Repair looks like a neighbor bringing soup without announcement. Boundaries look like a two-sentence script that prevents relitigating. Language looks like careful stewardship, what is said, what is withheld and why. Ritual looks like planting bulbs in April and not photographing the act. These acts are not heroic. They are small, occasional, and often boring. Yet they are the durable work of keeping a household together. When people come to the house now, rain or shine, their eyes go to the photograph. Some ask the story, others only glance and move on. I offer the chronology, a sequence of dates and practices, because dates make the work sensible. A rupture is a point in time, but its meaning is made in the years that follow. August 2014 is where the fracture is located. Everything after it is an account of how we lived with that fracture. The practices we developed did not cure everything. They did, however, provide a framework, assume care until proven otherwise, prefer repairs small gestures over theatrical punishment, make apology specific and accompanied by practical steps, share labor so no one burns out, and cultivate private rituals that resist public spectacle. No tidy moral redemption arrived. But then, redemption is rare in daily life. What arrived instead was cumulative, an ease, a habit, a set of modest instruments, papers, cards, schedules, scripts, that allowed dignity to be practiced. The photograph on the easel is both a reminder of how complicated memory can be and a prompt. The quiet, repetitive tasks, binding books, delivering soup, listening on Thursdays, are the ones that remake a household into a place where dignity can be practiced rather than merely debated. After the modest instruments of care had been put in place, index cards on November 26, 2015, the binder in March 2016, the naming ritual on November 24, 2016, the family agreement in April 2017, the rotating caregiving schedule in January 2018, they encountered tests that were not hypothetical. The first of those tests came in the small escalations that followed Thanksgiving 2018. What had been a tense table in 2014 and a fragile choreography of repair in the years after it became, by late 2018, a routine of negotiation and relapse. Some family members returned to patterns that made the household shudder, others withdrew entirely. Those setbacks after Thanksgiving 2018 were not dramatic in the ways tabloids imagine. They were not public spectacles, they were a series of silences and missed calls, of one cousin stepping away and of another picking up an extra Thursday reading shift. But in the aggregate they threatened the fragile ecosystem the family had been cultivating for 4 years. Because we had documented things, a vote in August 2014, the Thanksgiving of November 27, 2014 when repair began, the index card experiment on November 26, 2015, the binder assembled in March 2016, the relapses could be named without inventing moral language. Naming gave the relapse contour, chronology gave it context. We could say, without shouting, that the table had cooled since Thanksgiving 2016 and grown hostile after Thanksgiving 2018, and then we could point to the rotating schedule that had been introduced in January 2018 and ask, is that schedule still functioning? If not, why not? The work of repair in our household was procedural as much as it was ethical. The hospital plan drafted in March 2019 became one of those procedural safeguards that, in retrospect, was written at an auspicious moment. It codified who spoke to clinicians, where to look for insurance documents, and how to translate medical jargon for relatives who did not read charts for a living. That document, dry and bureaucratic as it seemed at the time, read like a small prophecy when the public attention that came in late 2019 rendered us suddenly visible to strangers. With the essay published in June 2017 and republished in September 2017 already circulating among reporters and columnists, the family had entered a public arena it had never asked to join. The late 2019 pickup in which a columnist linked to it produced a torrent of emails, praise from people who said the household practices had saved them, condemnation from others who argued we had tolerated too much, questions from activists who wanted to know whether an internal, private procedure could be a model for institutional reform. The winter of 2019 and spring of 2020 returned an inbox full of both warmth and vitriol. Some messages asked for names and details, others proposed partnerships, a few urged legal action. The family agreement about publicity, enacted in April 2017, had been designed precisely to prevent a single relative from weaponizing private pain into public spectacle. It required a majority authorization for any public statement about family disputes. That rule did not silence the internet, but it gave us a ground to stand on when tempers rose. We could point to a date, to a vote, to a binding process. It forced decisions into a deliberative space rather than into reactive posts. Then the world shrank. The pandemic arrived in ways we are still cataloging in social histories and private diaries. The arrival was not a single date for us. There were a sequence of cancellations and reschedulings, hand sanitizers and no visitors signs, but it did have moments that could be marked. In March 2020 we adjusted the rotating caregiving schedule to include remote check-ins. We altered the visiting protocol so that only the designated advocate would speak to doctors in person. We rehearsed the 2-sentence scripts that could stop relitigating arguments when tensions flared on cramped phone calls. The binder's index of numbers and the carefully noted dietary preferences became lifelines. When hospitals restricted visitors, our small bureaucratic rituals, who had the keys, who had the pill organizer, mediated care in ways big statements could not. Those months forced a reconsideration of proximity and responsibility. We discovered that some of the practices we had introduced because of scandal, sharing labor to avoid burnout, stewarding language, privileging curiosity over interrogation, were structurally useful in a pandemic. The neighbor with soup became a lifeline when soup was no longer casually dropped but delivered on porches and left within sight but not touch. The niece who read on Thursdays did so via video call. Planting bulbs in April remained a private thing. The ritual of burying small hopeful investments against winter felt like a defiance against the spectacle of snapping headlines. Humor persisted as immunization. The cousin who mock-raised an invisible hand at Thanksgiving now made an absurdist interlude on a group FaceTime that reduced temperature in a way a longer argument would not. Yet the limits of our methods were also apparent. Distance made caring harder. The people who had been on the margins of our arrangements, friends, neighbors, occasional help, were harder to marshal. Public attention did not disappear. In 2019 and early 2020, the work on op-eds and policy that had begun as a personal catalogue of methods became more formal. I was invited to speak outside of family rooms, to translate our small household experiments into language that might inform institutions, hospitals, elder care agencies, even municipal policies about family caregivers. Those presentations, the talks in New York on March 12, 2018 and in Boston in October 2018, already part of our public timeline, were attended by strangers who wanted templates. We carried our chronology with us. Dates mattered because they grounded anecdotes in a pattern of decisions. In panels and panels of policymakers, I said the same thing I said at the kitchen table. Small, repetitive acts and calibrated consequences can be more humane and more effective than spectacle. There were costs to that public role. Opening up process invites interpretation. Some journalists and columnists condensed our practices into moral judgments that did not reflect their complexity. The inboxes in late 2019 through spring 2020 contained both earnest requests for help and performative outrage. A few relatives felt betrayed by the translation of private practices into public proposals and withdrew further. Others were enraged that our family had been used to illustrate broader problems. The binder, the two-sentence scripts, the rotating schedule, objects meant to preserve dignity, had become symbols in a debate about responsibility, forgiveness, and exposure. We had to return to the family agreement about publicity, to the simple rule passed in April 2017, no public statement about family disputes without majority authorization. That rule became not an instrument of censorship but a boundary for care. The pandemic yielded an unexpected effect on the photograph on the easel. For years it had been a static index, an emblem of rupture, a chronological footnote for visitors who asked for the story, but now it acquired a new practical function. People would stand across the room on video calls and point to the photograph as if to locate a memory in place. The image allowed us to tell the chronology without verbalizing the most painful specifics. It anchored conversations that had otherwise frayed into recrimination. The photograph's caption, a small card I had written the night of the vote in August 2014, was read aloud by the niece on Thursdays when her voice otherwise read novels. The act of reading that caption in a small kitchen or on a pixelated screen felt like renewing a contract. This is our record, this is where we start. Because caregiving continued over years, practicalities accumulated. There were legal forms filled out in quiet afternoons in 2020 and 2021, powers of attorney updated, simple wills clarified, a designated healthcare proxy reaffirmed. We scheduled the neighbor rota so that no single relative carried the burden. We taught younger relatives how to keep the binder and how to set a calendar reminder for medication refills. Those days were not dramatic. They were administrative, spreadsheets, PDF attachments, phone numbers saved in redundant places. But they were the mechanical work of dignity, redundancy to prevent errors, scripts to prevent escalation, rituals to prevent spectacle. The years after the early pandemic became an exercise in layered restraint. Thanksgiving 2020 was small and virtual. The pandemic meant no large gatherings, and so the question of looking at my mother across a table, a painful social choreography that had marked earlier Thanksgivings, was deflected into pixels. That distance had mixed results. On the one hand, it removed the immediate pressure of sitting across from someone who had been the object of a vote and who carried in the room the invisible weight of what had happened. On the other hand, virtuality made some relatives braver. They made gestures in messages they would never have made across a table. We learned again, medium shapes behavior. A vote that had once been a physical count in August 2014 now had consequences in pixels and protocols. By 2021 and into 2022, the family learned to mix the old rituals with new cautions. The small strip of soil in front of the house continued to be planted each April because continuity mattered. The act of kneeling in soil, private, modest, unphotographed, was an assertion that some things remained beneath the surface of public argument. We renewed the rotating schedule when necessary. We refined the hospital plan drafted in March 2019 so it accounted for a sequence of ever-changing visitation rules. We kept teaching younger relatives how to de-escalate and how to ask the clarifying question at a bedside. The neighbor with soup, the niece who read on Thursdays, the cousin who learned to listen. These roles evolved but persisted. We found that when the default was care rather than accusation, more possible futures remained open. In public fora, I continued to offer the family's chronology as evidence that institutional practice could learn from household practice. I wrote op-eds in late 2019 and early 2020 about procedural accountability and capacity-restoring consequences. After the pandemic, those pieces were revised into primers for institutions thinking about caregiver support. Policy work does not move quickly. It is a year-by-year accumulation of meetings and memos. I testified at a local hearing in the spring of 2022 about a modest proposal, municipal funding for caregiver respite modeled on rotating schedules. I carried the photograph on the easel in my head as I spoke. August 2014, where the fracture is located, everything after it an account of how we lived with that fracture. The testimony was one small move in a larger arc. Policy is slow, culture is slower. There were relationships that never returned to what they had been in 2014. Some relatives walked away. Others remained, but remained scarred. The naming ritual on November 24, 2016 could not erase the power imbalances that a family vote had revealed. The vote itself remained a discrete point in our chronology and a lived reality that shadowed some rooms. 4 years, no one could look at my mother directly at certain gatherings because the vote had created a different kind of visibility, an asymmetry of gaze that functions like a social scar. That inability to meet the eyes of the person at the center of the rupture was not mere shyness. It was a social consequence of the choice we had made to resolve a dispute by counting hands. We learned to manage that consequence the way we managed a chronic condition, with scripts and rituals that prevented conversation from collapsing into accusation. We did not pretend the vote was neutral. The August 2014 vote remained an ugly, raw fact. It had consequences that were moral and psychic. But we also refused to let that single moment be the whole story. The photograph on the easel condensed both the vote and the years after. It was a compendium of damage and of the slow accumulation of repair. When someone asked whether we had forgiven, the reply was that forgiveness was not the only metric. We measured instead in acts, in whether someone brought soup without comment, in whether a niece still read on Thursdays, in whether the binder was updated in March 2016 and revisited in subsequent years. The work of living with a fracture is about such metrics. The later chronology, March 2019's hospital plan, the public attention of late 2019, the inboxes of winter 2019 and spring 2020, the policy and op-ed work of 2019 and early 2020, the pandemic adjustments in March 2020, and the incremental repairs and relapses through 2021 and 2022. Has solidified into a practice rather than an event. It is not a tidy redemption story. The household did not achieve moral perfection. It did, however, develop instruments that allowed dignity to persist. The binder, the rules, the scripts, the rotas, the plantings in April, the Thursday readings, the private rituals that refused photography. We taught younger relatives how to hold complexity without collapsing into spectacle. There is more to come. The work of translating domestic practice into public policy is ongoing. The rotating caregiving schedule has been proposed at a council meeting and will return to committee in the fall. The family agreement about publicity will again be tested by someone wanting to speak, and the photograph on the easel will be replaced one day by another image that continues the story. The chronology remains our method. Mark the fractures, invent practices that limit harm, repeat those practices until they become habit. That is how a household learns to keep going. The last thing I tell visitors who ask about the picture is simple and true. The vote in August 2014 remains a wound, but what occurred on November 27, 2014 and the small, repetitive acts that followed are how we chose to live with it, and we are still learning how to do that. The committee that had promised to take the rotating schedule seriously returned to business in the fall of 2022. My testimony from the spring was now part of a larger docket: minutes, cost estimates provided by a municipal budget analyst in June 2022, letters from caregivers and service providers collected in August, and an independent memo from a social services researcher submitted on September 14, 2022. The language I had used in March 2019, procedural accountability and capacity-restoring consequences, was echoed in the committee report, though refracted through bureaucratic terms: pilot, metrics, deliverables. The clerk called it a modest pilot, the council analyst called it a targeted respite program. In their minutes, what had begun at our kitchen table and been memorialized, awkwardly, on an easel photograph, was reduced to line items. That reduction was both necessary and infuriating. It forced whatever parts of the household practice we wanted to preserve into forms the city could finance and audit. On October 5, 2022, the committee voted to move the pilot forward as a recommended item for the full council, asking for a 12-month initial trial with a built-in evaluation at 6 months. The recommendation was accompanied by a modest appropriation, a line for stipends to rotate respite workers, funds for training in de-escalation and family scripting, and a small research contract to collect qualitative data from households that adopted the schedule. The motion passed on a procedural vote of 5-2. I remember the date because it felt like some formal recognition of the chronology we had kept. Dates mattered in policy rooms the same way they had mattered in our living room. The vote in committee was not a validation of our moral choices, it was an experiment in public administration. The residents who wanted to object to municipal involvement still did. The conservatives on the council raised predictable questions about whether the city should micromanage family life. The narrow majority that supported the pilot, however, had been persuaded by the operational case. Rotating respite could reduce emergency hospitalizations and caregiver burnout by creating predictable breaks and clearing bureaucratic pathways for backup. The City Council approved the pilot on January 17, 2023, for an 18-month trial beginning March 1, 2023. The program was intentionally modest: 20 households in the first cohort, explicit confidentiality requirements, a clause that any family wishing to withdraw could do so without penalty. The city's press release emphasized dignity and practical support. It did not and would not mention our family's photograph. That anonymity was crucial to the family agreement that dated back to April 2017. The agreement had survived tests in 2019 and the heated inboxes of 2020. It would face a new one now that municipal memos used some of our language. We convened a family call on February 2, 2023, an odd, compact meeting held in the evening so that East Coast and West Coast relatives could participate. We reviewed the language in the council's pilot plan together and agreed, by a margin that satisfied the agreement's majority rule, to allow the city to use anonymized case studies drawn from our practices as long as identifying details were removed. That February call was a rehearsal in containment. The public role we had accepted, advocating for policy change, had never meant that every intimate moment should be cannibalized for advocacy. We drafted a short, jointly authored statement for anyone who might be asked to speak. We would talk about procedures and scripts. We would not recount the vote. We would decline to comment on individual relationships. This felt ordinary in a way the August 2014 vote had never been. Practice had taught us how to close a conversation. The family agreement was not a prohibition but a tool. It protected people who wanted privacy and it made public engagement possible for those who believed it mattered. March 1, 2023, the pilot launched. The first cohort included 2 single parents, a household caring for a middle-aged sibling with early-onset dementia, a retired teacher, and a mixed-generation family that looked a little like mine. Rotating responsibilities, simple scripts, a binder kept in the kitchen. The municipal team came to our house on March 12 to observe, not to take photographs but to watch how we organized the binder and how we practiced a handoff script at the front door. They made notes, their clipboards removing the intimacy of the moment. I made my own note about how strange it felt to be both subject and advisor. The evaluation committee asked for specific metrics: reductions in emergency room visits, caregiver self-reports of stress on validated scales at baseline and 6 months, an independent assessment of whether the scripts reduced conflict during handoffs. What they did not and could not measure easily was the less quantifiable thing that had sustained us: The awkwardness of not looking at certain faces in a room and how one learned over years to teach other people not to weaponize that awkwardness. Between March and October 2023, the pilot produced small, meaningful data. At the 3-month check-in in June 2023, the research team reported anecdotal notes from a social worker who had observed a household that had previously been prone to midnight disputes. In that household, having a clear script for taking over medication refills cut the number of late-night panics from 4 in a month to 1. Another household reported that rotating respite reduced feelings of resentment because each adult had a predictable, counted share of responsibility. These were not sweeping results. They were incremental. And incremental was our history. The city scheduled a public roundtable on September 28, 2023, to discuss interim findings. I sat at the table and listened as municipal staff read passages from the binder I had given them, passages that in 2016 would have been private instructions for how to say no kindly. In the room were people who had been at the kitchen table during the vote and people who had not been alive then. The photograph on the easel was not present. The family had voted to keep that image a private artifact. But the chronology was there, translated into policy vocabulary. While the pilot ran, family life continued its own schedule of slow repair and relapse. Thanksgiving 2023 was the first holiday since 2019 in which more than a handful of relatives attended in person. We observed precautions, rapid tests on arrival, seating that allowed distance for those who preferred it, but it felt recognizably like Thanksgiving, with the same small rituals: 2 pies, the niece reading aloud, the small strip of soil recipients of leftover bread. The asymmetry of gaze remained, but it softened in some quarters. My cousin who had once refused to look at my mother across a table found a way to look at her for brief moments during the meal. Long enough to greet her and short enough to avoid opening old arguments. That was not reconciliation in any dramatic sense, it was a small tolerance. In private conversations afterwards, several relatives remarked how deliberate staring had become both a restraint and a barrier. For them, being able to meet someone's eyes again, briefly and without comment, felt like learning to use an old tool differently. Health episodes continued to test those skills. In June 2023, my mother was admitted to the hospital for a dehydration episode that the hospital record dated as June 21, 2023. The hospital plan drafted in March 2019, revised in 2020 and again in 2021, was used that week. Scripts were read at 2 a.m. in the emergency department by a niece who had been trained to de-escalate and to ask narrow, clarifying questions. Those scripts prevented a late-night argument about who should accompany my mother to a CT scan. Instead of an accusation-filled exchange. Who last gave her water? Who checked the medication? The room had a quick read of the binder, current medications, dietary preferences, a note that my mother preferred buffered explanations, not blunt corrections. Those small practices mattered. The hospital discharge planner noted in the record that the family had provided a rotating schedule and had designated a single health proxy to sign forms. That administrative clarity sped up discharge and eased a potential readmission. We took those bureaucratic efficiencies as a kind of victory. Not for virtue but for the continued possibility of practical care. Public attention to the program ebbed and flowed. A profile that ran in March 2024 in a regional magazine had been cleared under the family agreement. It avoided personal details and instead used an anonymized vignette drawn from the pilot's evaluation. The profile brought new invitations: podcasts, panels, a request to draft an implementation guide for counties interested in trying a similar model. Those invitations reanimated old tensions. Some cousins felt we were risking another exposure. We convened the publicity vote in April 2024 and, by a majority as required, agreed to a careful level of engagement. Speak about policy and process, not about specific family dynamics, allow minimal, vetted background material for journalists, never permit photographs that could be traced back to the house on Elm Street. The agreement was tested again when a local television station asked for footage of a family handoff. We declined. The station ran a segment without family footage, using actors and an off-the-record voiceover drawn from the public brief we had provided. The piece reached viewers without exposing our living room. That felt like a compromise that recognized both the public utility of our practices and the moral privacy we were attempting to maintain. August 2014 remained an index point for everything that followed. On August 12, 2024, We gathered quietly to mark the decade since the vote. I had hesitated about marking the date publicly. Instead, we planned a private afternoon at the house, a planting in the little strip of soil as we had done every April, a rereading of the photograph's caption by the niece on the porch, and the replacement of the image on the easel with a different photograph. A candid, informal portrait taken in June 2023 in the hospital garden during a brief, lucid hour. The new photograph was not intended to signify forgiveness or closure. It was meant to track time and to show that the chronology continued. It placed in the public living room a different sort of visibility, one less about rupture and more about the persistence of care. We wrote a new caption that read simply, August 2014 rupture, November 2014, consequences, March 2019, hospital plan, March 1, 2023, pilot launched, August 12, 2024, another step. The caption was procedural, like the binder entries. It did not reconcile, it recorded. The municipal pilot concluded its 18-month period in August 2024 with a mixed but instructive evaluation. The formal report, filed on August 9, 2024, recommended scaling the program across 2 additional districts while refining metrics that better captured relational outcomes. Measures of communicative clarity during handoffs, for example, and instruments for assessing whether scripts reduced the social asymmetry of the gaze. The researchers conceded their methodological limitations. Counting did not always capture the quality of a conversation. The Council accepted the report's recommendations tentatively and directed staff to prepare a phased rollout contingent on additional funding in the 2025 budget cycle. It was, in policy terms, a cautious next step. It was, in family terms, recognition that the method, chronology plus practice, had instantiation outside our 4 walls. Inside the house, something else changed slowly. The protocols we had devised reached the younger generation, not as edicts but as habits learned while doing. The nieces who had been teenagers in 2016 were now adults who understood the script for offering water, the 2-sentence de-escalation lines, how to keep a binder clean and accessible. In early 2025 they began teaching these practices in community workshops that were part of the pilot's public education component. They were sometimes met with skepticism. People resisted prescriptive language about care, but more often audiences found the scripts oddly liberating. Having words for what to say reduced the temptation to make moral pronouncements. The family's role in public education had shifted from example to instrument. The practices we had developed were being abstracted into tools others could adopt and adapt. Yet distance and damage coexisted. Some relatives who had left after 2014 did not return. The naming ritual on November 24, 2016 had altered certain relationships permanently, a few remain estranged. The asymmetry of gaze, no one could look at my mother directly at certain gatherings for years, had not entirely disappeared, though it shifted from being an enforced silence to a regulated one. The household learned new ways to teach people to look and to look away, to punctuate a glance with a script that neutralized accusation. That teaching required patience. At Thanksgiving 2024 we noticed it. A cousin who had once refused eye contact now sustained a brief, deliberate look before stepping away to refill a serving dish. Another relative still flinched, demonstrating how long a social scar can last. These small gestures mattered because they were visible and practicable, repeatable steps that signaled a potential for different social choreography. My own public work continued to feel split between policy and private care. I wrote a piece in January 2025 that reflected on the municipal pilot's limitations and its promise. The essay traced the chronology carefully, August 2014 as rupture, November 27, 2014 and the months that followed as the work of living with consequences, March 2019's hospital plan as a formal instrument we had to build, March 12, 2018 and October 2018 as the moments when our local experiment entered public conversation, late 2019 and early 2020 as the period when those private methods were debated in public fora, March 2020 and the pandemic adjustments as the unanticipated accelerant, the committee vote on October 5, 2022, the council vote on January 17, 2023, and the pilot's launch on March 1, 2023, all signposts in the long arc. The essay was read by policymakers and by families who wrote to say that, for the first time, there were words they could use at their own kitchen tables to regulate dispute and distribute labor. Those letters were the sort of response any public-facing caregiver learns to value more than praise. small notes that attest to the practical use of an idea. The chronology continued to be both a constraint and a resource. It constrained because we could not forget August 2014. The vote had made a wound that bled into many subsequent interactions. It was a resource because it provided a map of when and how practices had been introduced and what their effects were. When we argued about publicity, about what to allow into the public record, about whether to permit another profile, we returned to dates and minutes and the family agreement. Chronology was not just a rhetorical device, it was a governance tool that structured both care and speech. Looking forward from late 2025 into 2026, the municipal program is slated for a modest expansion pending the 2026 budget. The family will reconvene its public agreement review in March 2026 to revisit the boundaries we set in 2017 and again in 2024. The photograph on the easel, now the June 2023 hospital garden image, will remain in the living room, read periodically as a record rather than an accusation. We continue to teach the younger relatives how to hold scripts and binders while recognizing that no protocol is a panacea. The vote in August 2014 remains a wound and a historical fact that organizes subsequent choices, but the years since, November 27, 2014, and the small acts catalogued in binders and policy memos, are how we chose to live with that wound, and we are still learning how to do that.